This is one of the things we cleaned up. Less than 100 years ago in New York City, this was the Lower East Side, filled with horse poop as people were coming and going. Sometimes it was so deep they would actually get stuck with their wagons. Also, about 100 years ago, we were dumping sewage from our toilets into rivers, and in the Delaware River, less than 100 yards below that inlet that you just saw, children were swimming in the river. So this was not good for their health. But because of those cleanup efforts, chronic diseases are now the main causes of morbidity and mortality in developed countries. And chronic diseases include such things as cancer, neurological disorders, immune dysfunctions, lung diseases, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. What's characteristic about chronic diseases? Well, they persist for a long time. They're not prevented by vaccines or cured by medication, and they're not communicable, and they do not just disappear. Moreover, they can result from things like bad luck, unfortunate genes, voluntary behavior, or as I will discuss, the actions of others. And they can also interfere with lifelong normal good health and flourishing. Toxic substances cause the same kinds of chronic diseases, whether they're neurological, immunological, cancers, lung disease, coronary artery disease, or some diabetes. You can trace some of these diseases to something in all of these categories of diseases to toxic substances. Now, how does a moral philosopher get interested in this? Well, we study and write about actions, policies, or states of affairs that are, among other things, right, wrong, just or unjust, and justification for their rightness or wrongness. Legal philosophers study laws and institutions and how they should function. So my training is in both of those areas, and I've been interested in how laws and science can do something to prevent diseases from molecular substances. We're all familiar with the various visible means of inflicting harm, such as bullets, knives, and blunt objects. Here's some famous devices for inflicting harm. But philosophers haven't, for the most part, been interested in invisible molecular agents, but they can also cause harm. So here's a picture of diethylstilbestrol, which, when taken by a pregnant woman and exposing her female fetus in utero, caused vaginal cancer 20 years later in that young woman, and 20 years after that, breast cancer in the young woman. So the question is, how can we use law and science to reduce these harms? So I've been thinking about what does justice have to say about preventing chronic diseases? Well, of course, chronic diseases can cause substantial harm on their own, but they also arbitrarily interfere with opportunities for a flourishing normal life. And there's a very powerful justice principle articulated by John Rawls called fair equality of opportunity that identifies important justice goals. I'll just talk about one aspect of this. Good health protection and healthcare institutions help to counter diseases that can frustrate lifelong opportunities to pursue careers or change them. That tends to be Rawls's emphasis, but it's been expanded by Norm Daniels and things I've talked about. These diseases can interfere with our development of life plans, our modification of them, and pursuing our life plans beyond working years. So here's an example of a person whose life plans were undermined. Brian Millward was a refrigerator repairman who was exposed to benzene from the products of 22 different companies. And at age 47, keep in mind that age, 47, he developed benzene-caused leukemia. His disease, chemotherapy, diabetes, and a rare bowel disorder left him 10 years later, as he put it, with absolutely ridiculous fatigue. So you might say that his career and lifetime opportunities were greatly diminished. He had to retire, take disability, and he can't do what he loves now, even though he's retired. He can't repair race cars, work in his yard. He can't even play with his grandchildren. He's so exhausted. As he puts it, here's his assessment of it. It just sucks when you get a cancer like that. I agree. But other people have an arc of good health and opportunities by avoiding serious chronic diseases, where it's people that, the oldest folks to climb the highest mountain in Africa, Kilimanjaro, or they climb the highest peak on the face of the earth, or a cyclist whose ability to process oxygen is increasing at 105 years old. Here's the oldest marathoner that finally retired at age 105. The oldest woman finally retired maybe at 92. She had a cancerous wound on her leg, and I don't know if she's going to fully retired or not. And of course, Diana Nyad completed a 90-mile swim from Cuba to Florida at age 64, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar played professional basketball until he was 42. So they avoided serious chronic diseases and had a flourishing life. So how do we prevent diseases that curtail fair equality of opportunity? Well, we design our health institutions to prevent diseases by making preventive medicine available and by making environmental health protections available. When people get sick, we treat the diseases that undermine people's health, and we ensure or try to ensure medical health care, as you now know. And a third point, which I won't talk about the latter 2 points, but also the argument is that fair equality of opportunity would commit us to maintaining the chronically ill as close to normal functioning as their ages and conditions allow. So for example, somebody who's in a car accident and breaks a back and severs a spine, we give them health care and we make accommodations so that they can live as normal a life as possible, and so forth. So what's the law's contribution to just health care and protection? Well, administrative health laws can prevent or reduce toxicity-caused chronic diseases. And the question I've been interested in, one of the questions, is how well have these laws functioned? There are two generic strategies for administrative health law to prevent diseases from chemical creations. One is pre-market laws that are used for pharmaceuticals and pesticides. And this is an excellent model. These laws legally require routine toxicity testing and agency approval before they can enter commerce and enter the market, and people are exposed. There are also procedures for removing them after risks or harms are shown. The other category are post-market laws, what I'm going to call old TSCA, because it's now been finally superseded, which I'll talk about toward the end. But under old TSCA, chemical creations entered commerce with no legally required routine testing or approval, and this covers about 90 to 80% of chemical creations, whereas pharmaceuticals and pesticides are only about 10 to 20% of chemical creations. And post-market laws also authorize how you would remove substances when they begin to show risks or cause harm. But old TSCA has a real problem. It grandfathered 62,000 substances, general chemicals, as safe in 1976. And since that date, over the last 40 years, it's permitted another 22,000 into commerce, almost all of them with little testing and most of them with no testing whatever. So how well were carcinogens controlled under this in 1987, excuse me, under this 76 law? A subcommittee of a congressional committee authorized the Office of Technology Assessment to conduct this report identifying and regulating carcinogens. And that year, I happened to be a congressional fellow, and I provided free help to the Office of Technology Assessment and made the report possible, simply because I was free help. So we looked at what the different administrative agencies had done by way of reducing carcinogens. And what we found was that reducing them was slow, science-intensive, post-harm or post-risk certainly, leaving citizens exposed. And we also found that federal agencies had acted on less than 1/2 of the substances with their purview. Meaning they hadn't acted on them, meaning they hadn't even looked at them yet. So if they looked at them and said, well, these don't pose any risk, that's acting on them. If they looked at them and says they pose risks and we need to do something about them, that's also acting on them. If they hadn't even looked at them yet, that was not acting on them. And that was true for about 1/2 of them. So what are justice aspects of the science law interaction in post-market administrative agencies? Well, it seemed to me as I reflected on what we found in Congress under the Office of Technology Assessment study, was that often rigid scientific norms frustrated good legal and health norms. One example for those of you that have had statistics is that people might insist on epidemiological studies, and if those are too low powered, they aren't going to detect risks even when they're present. And you find that this is still going on today. I was asked to write an amicus brief for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals last spring and found that one of the parties to the litigation was still making the same mistake. They were demanding too much by way of the statistical studies, and that guaranteed you wouldn't find anything. So the justice, a further justice issue is, with sufficient exposure, sluggish regulation leads to more cancers and more diseases. And this is illustrated by the fate of Sandy Guest. She was a hairdresser, and she used a substance called Brazilian blowout, which had formaldehyde in it, and it straightened hair. But she died of leukemia at age 55. Now, why is this a matter of justice? Well, it turns out that over a 30-year period, from 81 to 2011, 17 studies had revealed formaldehyde caused various cancers, nasopharyngeal, sinonasal, and myeloid cancers. And she died of acute myelogic leukemia. We still do not have any EPA protections despite these studies and despite a lot of animal data as well. So what happened? Industry resistance and slow EPA review likely led to her death. So you might say that a company that made the Brazilian blowout and administrative institutions failed her. They treated her unjustly. But there are other people that have been treated unjustly too, and we know this from various tort or personal injury cases. DuPont and 3M made a substance called C8 or PFOA. I'm not going to worry you over the chemical names. I might have difficulty pronouncing them anyway. But this is the main ingredient in Teflon and Gore-Tex. And 3 people contracted kidney cancer by drinking water contaminated with C8 in southern Ohio and northern Virginia. It killed Wilbur Tennant's cattle. An interesting story in all this, but I won't pause over this. Now, if you have questions, we can do that later. But in the end, DuPont had to settle a personal injury suit for $671 million to cover damages affecting 3,500 plaintiffs and their communities. And this doesn't cover the cleanup by and large, because DuPont at one point did an internal study and said, should we clean this stuff up? And they looked at it and said, no, we shouldn't, because it would just bankrupt us. It would cost too much. So again, you would say that DuPont, the company, and administrative institutions failed these people. The tort and the personal injury law redress some of the harms, and that's in tragic failures, but I do not talk about it today. So what are some of the moral justice issues under administrative law? Well, stringent scientific norms dominated legal values. Were the administrators gripped by a too rigid scientific paradigm? I think that's a problem. This resulted in public health underprotection of citizens, and they paid insufficient attention to the legal goals. We can see this by considering what a major toxicologist in 1990 wrote about what it would take for him to judge that something was a known human carcinogen. He said, look, you have to have several well-developed human epidemiological studies of exposed population that show the harm. These have to be supported by good and valid animal data, mimicking human exposure, so the exposures ought to be about the same. You have to have corroboration from short-term tests. Biotransformation of a substance in animals and humans must be similar, and there must be similar mechanisms of action in humans and animals. Well, I would argue that this is vastly too demanding for protecting the public health. And in fact, one of my favorite examples comes from the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And what the work of this international institution shows is that scientists try to use all the relevant scientific evidence they can find to determine the toxicity or carcinogenicity, in the case of IARC, of the substance in question. So here's a substance, again, I'll give you the acronym, not the name. MOCA is a curing agent. It is a known human carcinogen. It satisfies, it's pigeonholed in the same way that Arthur first sought to pigeonhole substances. But there's no human statistical evidence. You have excellent animal data. You have 3 humans that had asymptomatic bladder tumors and very short MOCA exposures. and 2 of the men were under 30 years of age. So these were young people exposed to mocha, and they were beginning to develop bladder cancers. IARC also found identical mocha and DNA adducts where the mocha attaches to the DNA, disrupts it, and starts it down the path to causing cancer. So they found the same effect in both animals and in only one man. And they judged that mocha is comprehensively genotoxic. That was enough for them. They didn't need a phalanx of statistically significant human studies to come to this conclusion. So that's one of the problems with post-market laws and being too rigid about the science that you demand to come to your conclusions. But in 2007, the scientists started exploring another area of research called the developmental origins of disease. And I thought this was a total game changer in terms of protecting the public, because it reveals much worse shortcomings of post-market laws. Children are among the most vulnerable humans that are exposed to toxicants. And then the question is, how well do these laws protect them? So what is the developmental basis of disease? Well, some chronic diseases originate from environmental insults during development, from embryos to fetuses to infants to teenagers. And the major mechanisms are epigenetic phenomena that turn genes on or off at the wrong time or alter protein regulation. But they likely do not change DNA sequences themselves, but they change how the DNA sequence functions. And why are children especially vulnerable? I'll come back to some of these points. But 5 things: they have greater exposures per body weight, they're more susceptible to toxicants, they have lesser defenses, they have a longer lifespan for diseases to develop, and some of these adverse effects are irreversible. So what about this longer lifespan? Well, here's the idea. If an infant or a developing child in utero is exposed to a toxic substance, they have an entire lifetime for that disease perhaps to develop. If I'm exposed, I'm old enough that the disease may never appear before I die from something else. So their having a longer lifespan is an important feature about children. 3 major catastrophes signaled these findings and led people to begin to think about the developmental origins of disease, but not immediately. In utero exposures to methylmercury, thalidomide, and diethylstilbestrol. So here's a picture of a child with cerebral palsy. Methylmercury was dumped into Minamata Bay in Japan. Fish absorbed the methylmercury. Women and men ate the fish. Women and men were affected by the methylmercury in that with neurological problems, but the women that were pregnant shared the methylmercury with their children that were developing. And some of those children were born with cerebral palsy. They also had a host of other diseases that you'll see off to the side here. There were 265 official victims, and another 10,000 were compensated by the Japanese. First trimester ingestion of the sedative thalidomide led to children being born with extra appendages or shortened limbs, so that thalidomide was pushed by the Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals as something that would help women in their first trimester of pregnancy when they were vomiting and not sleeping well and so forth. But that's precisely the period of a growing infant's life where they're beginning to develop appendages. And what happened was that these were truncated. And so you have a child here with a thumb in the wrong place, a shortened arm, but there are a host of other problems. 5,000 to 7,000 children are estimated worldwide to have been born with shortened limbs. Another 7,000 to 8,000 were never born at all because they were stillborn. The third example is in utero exposure to a synthetic estrogen that I've already mentioned, diethylstilbestrol. A woman taking that while pregnant put a female child at risk for developing cervical vaginal cancer at age 20. And then 20 years after that, the DES daughters, were at increased risk of breast cancer. Incidentally, the mothers were also at increased risk of breast cancer because of the dosage of DES, a synthetic estrogen, that they took while pregnant. So what do we know about our contamination? The Centers for Disease Control has identified about 304 man-made toxicants that contaminate citizens. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology has identified that pregnant women can harbor up to 43 toxicants. It's not that they choose to do this, it just happens by living. And newborns have been born with toxicants in their bodies. And here are some sources of contamination illustrated by a slide created by Tracy Woodruff in the obstetrics unit of the University of California, San Francisco Medical School. You can just see we get introduced to chemical substances in a variety of places by a variety of means. We can ingest them, inhale them, or absorb them through the skin. Now, I think that the developmental basis of disease shows the urgency to change legal approaches. This new science and our permeability to toxicants, humans' permeability to toxicants, shows the inadequacy of legal protections. We can't prevent the permeability. They come in. Actually, I asked Jerry Heindel of the Centers for Disease Control, I said, Jerry, do all toxicants come into our body? He says, yes, except for very large macromolecules that sometimes come in one end of your body and go out the other without being processed by the body. But most of them get processed by various biological processes, and they may or may not affect you. So laws preventing toxicants from entering commerce and preventing our exposure would really be the best approach. We do know that women's chemical burden is shared with developing fetuses and newborns. I've given you pictures of that. Here's what one of the leading developmental biologists says. The vast majority of chemicals given a pregnant animal or woman reach the fetus in significant concentrations soon after administration. We now know also that plastic nanoparticles cross the placenta. So you chemistry students that are creating nanoparticles, you may want to think about checking about what happens to those nanoparticles in a pregnant woman. Our picture of the womb, our collective picture of the womb, as it were, has changed. In the 60s and up into the 80s, it was perceived as something like a comparatively impermeable barrier that protected a developing child inside the mother's body. She was seen as the fetal incubator of a developmental program. But pregnant women are now seen as the fetal environment with developed much more of an open system. So that being housed in the uterus or colloquially in the womb, the child gets hormones, light, food, but if the mother's body has toxicants, they enter as well. Developing children have greater exposures. They have larger toxic doses per body weight than the mother via their cord blood or their breast milk. Methylmercury, for example, this is why it was so devastating, concentrates 5 times higher in the fetal brain than in the mother's blood. So even though she has a certain level in her blood, the fetus will have 5 times that amount in the brain. Lipophilic substances, fat-loving substances, concentrate in cord blood and breast milk. And lead is transferred from the mother's bones to the developing child via the calcium stream. You may want to ask about that. I don't want to take time now to talk about it, but it's an interesting story. Developing children have greater exposures after they're born. Because they're growing fast, they have higher metabolism, breathing, absorption, circulation rates. They have higher fluid and food intake per body weight. And of course, we know what children do. They play close to the ground, mouth everything in sight, and ingest more dust and everything that's in the dust. Growing children can be exquisitely sensitive. Tiny doses can pose problems. Mutagenic carcinogens have no threshold for toxicity. Lead has no identified threshold for toxicity. Even though these researchers listed here have been looking for it, they cannot identify a safest low level of lead. A single thalidomide pill caused malformations in at least 1 child, according to researchers who've looked into this. And a single dose of valproic acid in animal studies can cause autism-like behavior. So tiny doses can trigger diseases. Sometimes low doses cause greater harm than larger doses. For example, low doses of tamoxifen, which is a synthetic estrogen, inhibit breast cancer cell growth. Lower concentrations stimulate breast cancer. So high concentrations inhibit breast cancer growth, lower concentrations, stimulate it, and at the highest doses, it's acutely toxic. So it's a very strange dose-response curve. Developing children are more susceptible than adults to toxicants because these disrupt differentiating cells and forming tissues, altering their physiological functions, and children have lesser defenses because they have less developed immune systems, blood-brain barriers, livers, and detoxifying enzymes. And a couple of the organ systems are extremely susceptible. So the developing brain and the immune system are uniquely susceptible. Brains, think about your brain. As you begin developing from a fertilized egg, your brain eventually grows from a single cell into billions, and that's not a typo, and must follow precise pathways in the correct sequence to function properly. For both systems, both the developing brain and the immune system, there is one chance to get it right, according to the researchers that look at these things. Individual genetic variation increasing the vulnerability because some individuals, including children, are more susceptible to the products of combustion, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, than the average. Some are more susceptible to organophosphate pesticides than the average, and some are more susceptible to methylmercury than the average. So within the genetic variation of the human population, some people are going to be more susceptible, some less susceptible. And a variety of diseases arrive from in utero, early childhood, or teenage toxic exposures. You might get, so neurodevelopmental diseases are caused by some of these exposures, and we've talked about them. So for example, mental retardation, autism, and cerebral palsy come from exposure to neurotoxicants. The annual cost in 1997 was $9.2 billion from these exposures. Lead causes neurodevelopmental disorders. It lowers IQs, causes motor skill problems, causes attention deficit disorders, violent behavior, that's also an interesting question that I won't develop now, and cardiovascular disease. The estimated annual costs of pediatric lead poisoning in 1997 was huge, $43.4 billion, and all the costs of lead are from the environment. It's not as though people ingest lead typically in any systematic way or come into contact. It's through some environmental exposure. Immune system dysfunctions may affect many organ systems, whether it's the respiratory, the neurological, the cardiovascular, the dermal, or the gastrointestinal system. So the costs of pediatric asthma of environmental origin in 1997 were $2 billion. Exposed infants have greater dose sensitivity and severity effects and persistence than adults, according to the Cornell researchers that have looked into this. So it gets like a lot of these substances, it's much worse for children than it is for adults. The Cornell researchers also have been able to identify adult follow-up diseases that grow out of childhood or infant immune system diseases. So whether it's inflammatory bowel disease or infant respiratory infection and rhinosinusitis, or childhood asthma or type 1 diabetes, these may be associated later in life with adult diseases that grow out of those sources, as it were. Childhood cancers begin in the womb. So there are two major types, acute lymphoblastic leukemia and acute myeloid childhood leukemias. Pesticide exposures are associated with both, with an 11-fold multiplier for ALL and 14-fold multiplier for AML. Both paternal father and maternal mother exposures can elevate these risks. Typically, childhood cancers take 2 hits. In utero chromosomal translocations that I just mentioned, that this work has been done by Martin Smith at UC Berkeley, and followed up by a major immunological stress. But it isn't just that the childhood cancer is the only thing. Along with childhood cancer goes secondary diseases or secondary cancers or other diseases, neurological problems, failure to thrive, earlier mortality, accelerating the aging process. And so both the disease and the treatment morbidities hamper lifetime opportunities. The estimated costs of childhood cancer due to environmental origin in 1997 were about $332 million. Reproductive disorders can result from toxic exposures. We've already met diethylstilbestrol, and I talked about that. But it isn't just that that's an initial cancer. I had the opportunity to interview a DES daughter, and she was a little reluctant to talk about this, understandably. But I said, what's it like to have vaginal cancer? So, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. She said, well, she had multiple operations to burn out her new cancers over time. She may not have children. She may not take birth control and some postmenopausal drugs because of her early exposure to DES. If you think of breast cancers as something like a reproductive disorder, the effects are worse in children and adults. Breast cancer risks are higher for teenage exposures than for adults. To radiation, they're 3 to 5 times higher. And for DDT, they're 5 times higher. There have been very good studies of DDT and radiation, by the way. Animal data, interestingly, show transgenerational reproductive disorders. In utero toxic exposure, typically to estrogen, estrogen and other mimics, during the time that reproductive organs are developing in animals, causes transgenerational reproductive harm and some cancers in males and females alike through 4 generations. Just to give you an example, male rats exposed while their reproductive organs are developing are born. They seem fine, but when they reach adulthood, they may be sterile, they may have damaged sperm, they may have low sperm count. But the same is true of their sons, their grandsons, and their great-grandsons. And they then begin to develop other disorders like cancers and diseases at other sites. Obesity is a chronic condition that's associated with other diseases, such as type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, high blood pressure, asthma and pulmonary disorders, gallbladder, and kidney diseases. So a single dose of diethylstilbestrol, remember a synthetic estrogen, or other estrogens, is sufficient to cause obesity in mice in animal studies. There is not an energy imbalance. It is the role of the toxic substances. Here's a couple of pictures. You have same genes, same diet, same exercise, different in utero exposures to synthetic estrogens. But I really think the next picture is better. This is my favorite picture. This is a mouse you don't want to meet in a dark alley. Same genome, same diet, same exercise, different in utero exposure to 1 dose of a synthetic estrogen, 8 parts per billion, that methylated a gene. So it isn't just that pregnant women being exposed to toxic substances is the only problem. Contaminated daddies can affect the issue as well. So toxic contamination of males can produce miscarriages or other problems, whether they're from pharmaceuticals, lead, mercury, pesticides, solvents, dyes, and other paints. So it seems to me that contaminated parents pose both occupational and developmental justice issues. As the Center for Public Integrity says, workers are callously unprotected, and I believe that is correct. Yvette Flores, they did a story on Yvette Flores' body, as they put it, was a toxic warehouse before her son Mark was conceived. Mark was born with extensive cognitive impairments caused by in utero lead exposure. So here's a picture of Mark and his mother. Spectrophysics, where she worked, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration failed both of those. They were treated unjustly, you might say. Mark is now 36. He has no ordinary lifetime opportunities. Let me repeat that. He has no ordinary lifetime opportunities. He can't talk. It's very difficult for him to learn. He may never get, I don't even know for sure, he may not ever get a grade school education. He won't go to college like you do. He cannot conduct daily living activities on his own. So justice, in the terms of protecting lifelong opportunities, requires more stringent occupational protections for adults and their children. And so what we learn from the exposures is that even tiny fleeting exposures can become, you might say, biologically embedded in children, grandchildren, or with unlucky timing, great-grandchildren and beyond, becoming transgenerational toxicants, causing adverse effects. So what should we do? Well, Congress, in 1976, Congress chose old TSCA to regulate 80 to 90% of chemical creations with post-market laws. There are now 84,000 in commerce with almost no toxicity data. They're going to remain there until EPA or another health agency carries a difficult legal and scientific burden of proof to reduce exposures. Post-market laws are too late to protect children because the substances are already in commerce, exposing children, adults, and their mothers alike. And if the exposures are great enough, they will be harmed. Post-market laws also frustrate better health protections because the EPA has the burden to reduce exposures. Companies pressure EPA to have doubt-free or ideal data before improving protections. And there are whole now corporate phalanxes of doubting experts to slow down health protections and keep chemical products that provide income to companies in commerce longer. And they've based this strategy on the tobacco industry that developed this slogan in 1969. This is from an internal memo in the tobacco industry. Doubt is our product, the best means of competing with the body of evidence that exists in the minds of the general public, and it also establishes a controversy. Remember the tobacco industry. Post-market laws frustrate improving health protections. So EPA has been delayed in issuing risk assessments for trichloroethylene for 20 years, dioxin for 25 years, perchloroethylene, an agent in dry cleaning establishments that's certainly been phased out in California and I think a lot of states, formaldehyde, more than 19 years, but and we saw what happened to the woman who used it, and naphthalamine, an ingredient in gasoline. In just this year in May, the American Chemistry Council went to EPA and said, wait a minute, you've got to reconsider formaldehyde because we have a new study. So this is just a tactic that's going to slow down further the issuance of a protection for formaldehyde. But the story is even worse. This is new today. I got an email from a lawyer who sent this story along. Monsanto presumably did an independent review of glyphosate or Roundup and found that it didn't pose any problems. Who wrote that independent review? Roundup scientists working for Roundup. And this has been revealed in a tort case because tort lawyers posted these internal emails showing it. I got it today. This was published in Business Week in August 9. Post-market laws, in my judgment, are unjust because they interfere with people's opportunities over a long time and they harm them. They cannot prevent chronic diseases and morbidity in children or adults. They undermine lifetime opportunities for some of us. Pre-market toxicity testing and approval laws for pharmaceuticals and pesticides are better, but even they sometimes miss adverse effects. And so the FDA and the EPA pesticide office needs to begin testing better for developmental toxicity. According to the Food and Drug Administration, this is posted now, but it didn't have a year on it, Food and Drug Administration says that most drugs are not tested for children, yet they're often prescribed for them. So you're taking risk for children by giving them adult medicines and so forth. So what can we do about toxicity-induced diseases? Remember how we collectively solved the environmental health problems 100 years ago. Vaccines won't prevent chronic diseases. Antibiotics won't treat them. The law must clean up toxicants and prevent new contamination, as public health officials once cleaned up streets, water, and the air. So now we can't see the stuff that's causing our problems, but we've got to clean it up. We need legal changes and a political commitment to their implementation. So I've argued for a long time that we should shift from post-market laws to pre-market laws. And surprisingly, as I was finishing the book Tragic Failures, Congress enacted a new TSCA called the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. How's that for a title? This requires EPA to make an affirmative action on the safety of a new chemical before commercialization. It seeks to protect susceptible and highly exposed populations. This is a great thing. Pregnant women, children, and workers. It eases the acquisition of needed data, makes it easy for EPA to require data, which was a real problem under old TSCA. It provides aggressive legal timetables to reduce old toxicants. But the legacy of 84,000 untested substances in commerce is overwhelming. Now, how many of these are still active? Well, it's unclear. Is it 10,000, 20,000? The most likely figure might well be 30,000. Nobody knows. They're trying to do an inventory of that. So what can we conclude? Well, toxic contamination is unavoidable. We can't hide. Routine pre-market testing under new TSCA could contribute to an arc of good health. Removing existing toxicants will likely be slothful because they're going to linger for decades. EPA just doesn't get to these things very quickly, and they will be fought every step of the way by the affected company. The Lautenberg Act would better serve justice if it were well and officially administered in the spirit of the law, and officials use science appropriate to the legal task. Will the new chemicals be properly reviewed for safety, supported by good toxicity testing with in-depth review, as are pharmaceuticals and pesticides, or will they only receive a cursory review with little or no testing? I'm sorry to report that the bad news is it looks like cursory reviews are being followed by the new administration under Donald Trump and under Scott Pruitt, the head of EPA. Since January 2017, the EPA has approved 26,600 new products to enter commerce, which is an unheard rate, and quite different from the reviews of pharmaceuticals and pesticides. How quickly EPA will act under enforceable deadlines for removing existing toxicants in commerce is unclear. The way that the EPA could distort the new law is by permitting in new products to commerce with little or no testing, and then insisting on quite detailed and doubt-free evidence before removing them for health risks. Neither of these approaches will protect the public well. I tried to articulate some of the alternatives in tragic failures. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions, or you can do your lab coat event.
When you ask questions, remember to say your name and state your name. Do we need to walk up to the? No. Okay.
Okay. Name. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi.
Hi, I'm going to have a little trouble hearing, I suspect, because of the echo in the room.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me? Hi.
Hi, much
Okay.
better.
My name's Tammy, and recently this year there was a big case on the Johnson & Johnson baby powder, where the woman who used it for decades and she developed ovarian cancer, I think.
Yes.
And I don't think baby powder is regulated by the FDA. So, and on the box itself, there are no warnings. So is there a way this could have been prevented?
I haven't looked at that information, but I believe you're correct. And in fact, this was called to my attention by a student 2 years ago in a course. I suspect that she had used Johnson & Johnson baby powder. And since that time, Johnson & Johnson has begun losing tort or personal injury suits because of people that used the baby powder. I believe there was a case in Los Angeles just a few months ago where Johnson & Johnson had to pay a woman a big number, like at least $120 million for compensatory and punitive damages for not paying better attention. One of the problems that arose with the baby powder is that sometimes it was contaminated by asbestos, and we know that's a serious cancer causer, and it may be that baby powder by itself has the same effect. So it gets into the sensitive tissues in the uterine tract, and it may well cause these problems. But that's the argument these days, and it seems to be winning in most cases in court. Not all, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi, my name's Victoria. So earlier in your presentation, you were talking about some statistics, or you mentioned it, but I was just wondering, the studies that you presented, do you know what controls they take in order to prove causation and correlation? Does that make
Which study?
Or just a lot of the studies you went through in your PowerPoint, you were saying how XYZ chemical caused XYZ cancer, but do you know like how they were able to prove or like be so sure of the correlation and the causation? Does that make sense?
Right. Well, the scientists are very careful about that. It's often said that, you know, the epidemiological statistical studies only establish correlation, and there's truth to that. But for example, the International Agency for Research on Cancer digs deeper. They may have animal studies that get the same results, but if they begin to understand the mechanism, they can say, look, we know what's going on at the mechanistic level, and we can say that you get exposure to this substance, it alters this important step on the way to cancer, and it's highly likely or certain that it causes cancer. The example I gave you from of MOCA, they had no human correlations, but they had a lot of good mechanistic evidence. And both the International Agency for Research on Cancer and the National Academy of Sciences and the EPA is going much more to mechanistic evidence, understanding the underlying biology of disease, so they can avoid some of those problems that can easily be challenged by saying, oh, it's only a correlation, it's not causation. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name's Jason. I was wondering, a lot of these new substances that are coming out that are going to be approved or not approved by these agencies, a lot of them, what if they have cause adverse conditions possibly 20, 30 years in the future? How is that being addressed for these new substances?
Well, I had a little trouble hearing your question, but let me answer the question I thought I heard, and if I didn't get it right, you can straighten me out. How can testing reveal something that's going to cause problems 20, 30 years in the future? That's the virtue of animal data, because animal data can reveal the production of cancers, which typically might take 10, 20, 30, 40 years to develop, but animals have a lifespan of only less than 3 years, 2 to 3 years, 2 to 2.5, 3 years. So you look for information like that. You also look for mechanistic information that affects the pathways on the way to causing cancer or other diseases, or look for ways in which estrogens or other substances like that cause perturbations in cells that may lead to cancers. So they look for ways to supplement, straightforward human evidence or straightforward animal evidence by trying to understand more about the underlying biology. Does that help? Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Lauren, and I was wondering what suggestions you might have for us as individual consumers to help protect ourselves from toxic chemicals.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. If you're interested in this, the Environmental Working Group website publishes a lot of information, typically about a lot of personal care products that they've found toxic substances in, and personal care products that don't have toxic substances. There's a medical school, Mount Sinai Medical School in New York City, typically has a newsletter on how to avoid some toxic substances. For example, things like, when you come in from out of doors, take your shoes off. Don't bring in the things you detect out of doors into their house. So here's a surprise. If you walk across an asphalt parking lot on a hot day, you're likely to pick up asphalt, which is a known carcinogen. If you bring it into your house, leave your shoes on, you leave traces of it in your on your carpet or in your floor or whatever. If you have kids crawling around, it's not so good for them. Doesn't mean they're going to get a disease, but that's just a hidden way in which these things can occur. So the other thing I would recommend is the environmental health newsletter. They have a lot of stories on exposures in our lives. And, you know, if you live in a town like Flint, Michigan that has lead in its water pipes, unfortunately, you're probably going to have to buy water to avoid the lead. I think they're going to have a serious lead problem there. But it is, I must say, it's not restricted to Flint. There are a lot of deteriorating water systems around the country. Does that help? Those are some ideas off the top of my head.
Yes, thank you.
May I add some information, Dr. Carl?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Padma. I got my postdoc from UCR. Under
Really?
Yes, with Dr. Eastman.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I just wanted to add that there are certain foods such as cilantro, selenium, garlic, and all these that are rich in selenium. They and some antioxidants. They actually detoxify the toxicants naturally.
Yeah. Yeah. That helps. Don't know how much, but it helps. Well, you studied with a great toxicologist. I talk to Dave a lot, so good for you.
Is he still the chair at UCR?
I think he's chair for one more year. He's getting fed up with it, so he would like to escape that.
We have never heard a chair say this in our lives.
Go back, and I have a question for you. You know, as modern society has increased the number of chemicals in the environment, just curious what your thoughts are on the understanding that even as the number of the chemicals enter the environment, the lifespan continues to increase. Based on your presentation here, that seems to be a contradiction. Can you explain what that might mean?
Right. Well, I don't know that I have the total answer, but we've done a lot of things to improve our health. We have better medical care than we once had. We have vaccines. We have antibiotics. And so we're not dying from other kinds of diseases. And it's probably going to be difficult to compare chronic diseases now with chronic diseases earlier, because chronic diseases let's say 100 years ago didn't tend to show up much because the population was dying of infectious diseases. So I think the gross observation of the gross statistics from the fact that we're living longer but have more chemicals, I don't think that means that the chemicals make us living longer, but I think it's going to be difficult to compare, get the right basis for comparing death from chronic diseases, which toxic substances tend to cause, with death from chronic diseases or diseases from chronic diseases 100 years ago, simply because they didn't have time to show up. And we may have been adversely affected both in morbidity and mortality by other causes, namely the infectious diseases. That's the best I can do at the moment. Think along those lines.
Well, go ahead. One more question. You got a little closer. You got closer.
Hi, my name
Hi.
is Danielle, and I was wondering if there was some sort of economic disparity in like who, in the cases that where people have contracted cancer, like maybe people with lower income who have, like based on the food that they eat or where they live or where they work, if they're more likely to be exposed to these toxins.
I didn't hear the beginning of that question, but I think you were pointing to people typically that are poor or a variety of ethnic minorities that can only, say, afford housing or live in areas or work in companies or industries where they're exposed to a lot of toxicants. And that's the whole issue of environmental justice. And it is particularly concerning because we simply don't pay enough attention to them. And I indicated that workplaces are particularly worrisome, and workplaces for people in low-income jobs are likely to be much worse. And it's very difficult to make workplaces cleaner because Companies hate the Occupational Safety and Health Administration because it means it's going to cost them money on the production side. They will have to spray dust so that dust isn't in construction sites, or they will have to put controls on asbestos fibers in the workplace as they did more than 30 years ago. It is a cost. But what I tell my students is when people get diseases, there will be costs. They're just less visible, they're dispersed, and so companies don't have a corner on costs. But what you have to do is look to the costs of making the world or the workplace a safer place versus the costs of diseases to individuals, to families, to medical care, medical servers, to insurance companies, and compare those with the costs of keeping the environment cleaner. And that's what a good cost-benefit analysis would do, but you won't hear that from the companies because they're only interested in discussing their cost basis, not the total cost of cleaning up or not cleaning up. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much. Oh,
Yes, thank you very much for your time. So I think we need to sign off here. And again, thank you, Dr. Craner, for spending an hour with us this afternoon talking about all the different ways that these toxicants in our environment can get managed from a legal perspective. So it's very interesting. We had a lot of attention here from the group. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I enjoyed it. Hope you did too. Hope you learned something.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.